This week we're going to build something completely ridiculous. It's a fancy tape dispenser, but for my favorite kind of tape, gaffer's tape. You see, a few years ago, Kampf built a tape dispenser for duct tape that looked like one of those disposable scotch tape rolls, but for duct tape. And it was made out of steel. It looked awesome. And I absolutely love that project, and it heavily inspired this one. But in my case, I wanted it to look like one of those classic desktop tape dispensers, using my favorite combination of woods, maple and walnut. I knew I'd be using my X-Carve to keep everything as accurate as possible, so I started doing my design in Fusion 360. First getting the critical dimensions of a gaff tape roll, and then creating the spindle and then the overall wooden base. The design has 4 layers that are all sandwiched together, maple forming the outer 2 layers and walnut as the center spacers. This dispenser is designed for a 2-inch wide roll, but you can easily scale it to fit any width you'd like. I also added holes to glue in some alignment pins to help with the assembly. For the cam setup, I start by drilling holes for the guide pins and then go on to the 2 pocket operations. The first one is for the cradle that the spindle pin rests in, and the second operation hollows out the cavity for the inside of the dispenser. I like to avoid changing bits in a single part if I can help it, but that meant committing to a 1/8 inch bit to drill the holes for the guide pins. As a result, I was in for a pretty long milling time. I'm not sure if the guide pins are really all that necessary as long as you're careful in your glue up, and if I designed this over again, my pins would be 1/4 inch wooden dowels so that then I could use the same size bit to reduce my milling time. Finally, I used a contour cut for the outer shape. Fortunately, the walnut pieces could be handled with just a drilling operation and a contour cut, so there are much shorter tool paths. I broke all of my stock down to the same size, 5.5 inches by 10 inches, and then clamped them down to the machine to let it get to work. One thing I'd learned while cutting the maple pieces. I'd set up the tool paths to use a conventional milling direction, but this ended up breaking off chips that were over 1 inch long when milling horizontally. Those chips were long enough to clog my dust extraction system a few times, but the problem went away when I switched to a climb milling tool path. With everything cut out, it was time to start assembling. I trimmed down some 1/8 inch steel rod into 2-inch lengths to work as the guide pins and then did my glue up. Once I had a solid piece, I sanded all the layers flush to each other and then added a bit of a roundover to all the exposed corners. I added a few layers of Danish oil, and then set the base aside to dry while I worked on the spindle. I was eager to see the project completed, so for the spindle shape, I just 3D printed it. The spindle rod was a short length of 1/8 inch steel, and I took some time to sand down the surface to remove the mill scale and give it a nice finish before punching it through the spindle. Last part to add is the blade. I heard plenty of advice using a hacksaw blade to do this, but I had this scrap piece of 2-inch wide steel, so I just used that, giving it a 45-degree bevel on one side and cutting it square on the other. I added 2 drill holes to secure it into place and then countersunk them so you wouldn't see the screw heads through the tape. Alright guys, thanks for sticking around to see how this turned out. I'm super happy with it. I can't wait to have this thing sitting on my desk for years to come, ready to dispense gaff tape whenever I need it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.